Well, good morning.
Good morning.
By now, you all know that Pastor Rick is not with us today. A few weeks, all needed rest and celebration. Today, we will be considering the biblical aspect of justice as an aspect of God's holiness. You know, in the West, our concept of justice, like so many other things that we run into, is borrowed from the ancient Romans. And this assimilation of concepts is really quite pervasive. Now let's look at just a few. Today you hear these are the dog days of summer that we're in now. This comes from ancient belief that the stars control our destiny. Now we look here, we see one of them. The dominant constellation in the summer was the dog constellation, Canis Major, with the tip being the brightest star in the sky, Sirius. And with a little imagination, you kind of see what the dog outline looks like. Now, for those of you that have Sirius XM, yes, that's the same Sirius that they will operate. It's a satellite radio station. And yes, their symbol is a little dog. This is where they took it from. The month of August that we're in right now was named after Caesar Augustus. Not a hard jump on that one. Now here we have a big guy. I don't want to meet him in a dark alley somewhere. He was Mars, god of war. March was named after him. Here we have the goddess Fortuna. Now, she was a goddess of prosperity. She would be over the seas and protect the ships as they brought this precious cargo in. And when people would be playing games of chance or something, she would tend to give an advantage to someone so they could walk off with a fortune. You're coming along today. Yeah. This expression of good luck, stems from this concept of imploring Fortuna to look favorably on you. And here we have one more. You may recognize her as the goddess Justice because of the scales in her hands. Now, she was a latecomer to this whole Roman hierarchy. She was literally invented by the Roman government to try to give some, shall we say, credibility to their justice system. She provided over criminal trials, cases, and wanted to ensure that the punishment kind of weighed off and met the crime. Not an unusual concept. The legal system we use today is literally based on the Roman concept of justice. Balancing the punishment against the crime is what we play in our daily lives. We also see this as fairness. We pay so much for one thing and it kind of balances out what we get for it. Many times we extend this concept of Roman justice to God and convince ourselves that God operates as a more powerful goddess justice. And that when we die and we stand before him in judgment, he'll just break out the scales and weigh our good deeds against our bad deeds. And so we're constantly hoping to do good things to try to kind of add to our side of the scale. But civil justice, as we see here, is not the same as biblical justice. Particularly not when it's used to describe an aspect of God's holiness. Today we'll look at some of the concepts in chapter 6 of Sproul's book, dealing with the holiness of God. And I hope you read through it to kind of get an idea of where we're going. We'll examine justice as an essential aspect of God's holiness and how justice is revealed in Scriptures. We will recount some of the famous storylines that you heard growing up and examine how these stories express justice and righteousness of God for us today. What is justice? We looked at the concept of justice developed by the Romans, and well, we know that it can be corrupted. But it's still, nonetheless, adopted by many people when they're thinking today. But what is true justice? What is that justice that flows from God? How does the Bible give us an understanding of this kind of justice? We see that justice must be grounded in God and in His revealed Word. In the Bible, the concepts of justice and righteousness are almost interchangeable. When you use one word, you're practically stepping right on top of the other one. Now, there are two ways we understand justice. Here we have some quotes from two very famous Dutch-American theologians. First one is Louis Berkhoff. He argues that God's justice is a mode of His holiness. Another famous Dutch-American theologian says, God's righteousness is God working outwardly to reveal and maintain His holiness. So here we have two kind of different views of justice, or shall we say, viewing justice from two different angles. But at its heart, both justice and righteousness mean a strict adherence to the law. I'll say that again. Justice and righteousness mean strict adherence to the law. Now, you remember when you were in second grade and you were learning arithmetic, and you learned how to add numbers, and things were going well as long as it was 2 plus 3 or 5 plus 7. But then all of a sudden the teacher gave you one where you had to add 12 to 18. What were you going to do with that? Well, she taught you that first of all you add the 2 to the 8. You carry the 1 over to the tens column and you add the tens column and you get the right answer of 30. This was a rule of arithmetic. So when you took your test at the end of the week and you were correct in all your answers, you could go running home, hanging your paper in your hand, showing your mother, I got them all right. Note that word, right. We could replace it with the following phrase. I understood the rule and law of arithmetic as it relates to addition, and I correctly implemented those rules in my test. That's what you meant, didn't you? There are laws. Now, when we think of God, we think of the righteousness of God, we realize that God is the one who makes the rules. And these rules are perfect. The writer of Psalms, Psalm 19, says the following. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The rules of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So not only are God's rules perfect, but He always acts in perfect accordance with His own rules. Isn't that nice? You get to make the rules, but then you got to live to them. That's what God does. He has made perfect rules, He has made perfect laws and precepts, and He always acts in accordance with them. This is what makes God just. He makes perfect rules and always acts in perfect accordance with them. Justice and righteousness are an integral part of His holiness. Now, the second view of justice is how it works outwardly to reveal and maintain His righteousness. God is not only the absolute standard, but He's also the one that upholds His own glory in the redemption of His people and in His judgment of all sin and evil. God's justice means that He will always take a righteous response to any assault on his holiness. He will always take a righteous response to any assault on his holiness. Steve Wellum says, God must act in holy justice against sin. He cannot overlook it. God cannot deny himself and still be God. Well then, how do we assault God's right holiness? Challenging thought. I love spaghetti. Many of you probably do also. But the problem I have with spaghetti is that whenever I would eat it, I would end up with the spaghetti sauce always splash over my shirt. Well, my wife, fastidious person that she is, immediately tells me how to go change my shirt. Since I was slow at doing that, as you might imagine, she decided she was going to solve the problem. And she went out, she bought me this big cook's apron, you know, the kind, the big white one that fits over your head and wraps around and ties. And she solved the problem. Because now the spaghetti sauce splashes, get on the apron, and I can take it off. And I'm okay. However, before she came up with this solution, I would try to clean the spaghetti sauce off my shirt. You know, you get the sponge and you kind of rub it and try to make it look okay. But in spite of this, as if we were going to go somewhere after dinner, she would inevitably tell me, go change your shirt. Of course, I thought the spots were, you know, they were just kind of small and they were kind of light and nobody would notice them, they weren't significant. She, of course, thought otherwise. We would sometimes get into an argument over this. I realize that's hard to imagine, particularly those who were in the conflict discussion at the adult ed hour a few minutes ago. This was a source of conflict for us. So one day, I asked her why a few faint spots on my shirt made her so upset. She had explained that my shirt was not just a reflection on me, but on her. It made her feel embarrassed and look as if she didn't care enough about me to make sure that I was properly and cleanly dressed. I had assaulted her righteousness by trying to execute my will. Not wanting to change the shirt. Well, needless to say, I learned to change the shirt. You know, at the heart of that dispute was an attempt by me to be right and to challenge her clearly superior rules on dressing presentably. Don't we do the same with God? We challenge his rules and assert that ours, whether they're rules or thinking or interpretations or understanding, whatever it is, are really right and better than his. We attack the righteousness of his rules. And in so doing, we attack his holiness. Now, an attack on God's holiness is not new. Isaiah recounts Satan's words in Isaiah 14, when Satan says, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. This was a specific assault on God's perfect rules, an assertion of Satan's will against God's holiness. After all, this, at its heart, is what sin is. Sin is when we choose to assert our rules over God's rules, thus assaulting his holiness. It's a challenge to God's perfect will. And as we just said, it is an assault to his holiness, and he will defend his holiness in a just and righteous way. This is the justice of God. And in such an encounter, guess who wins? Paul tells us, for all has sinned and come short of the glory of God. We've all waged this challenge and found ourselves awaiting the execution of God's justice, his righteous response to sin. We are unclean. We all have the spaghetti sauce on our shirts. But what about the consequence of this encounter for the challenger? Now, Adam certainly heard these words in the garden. For in the day in which you eat of it, you will surely die. Pretty straightforward. Paul confirms this. For the wages of sin is death, eternal separation from God. John reminds us in the book of Revelation, referring to the new heaven and the new earth, no unclean thing will ever enter it. As Isaiah proclaimed, we are undone. That is the outward working of God's justice. Now let's take a look at some of the events in the Old Testament for some examples of how this works. Our story begins in Exodus. After the 9 plagues have been cast, God assesses the situation and finds that the whole land of Egypt is full of sin. And because he is a righteous God, he is going to act. He's already demonstrated it on the first 9 plagues that he has power to do this. And now he's going to actually judge the sin on the 10th plague. First thing he does is he lays claim to the firstborn. And this firstborn is not limited to just the Egyptians. The firstborn includes all of the Israelites also. You know, the Israelites who were there for 430 years of captivity had entered into sin themselves. They began worshiping the Egyptian idols and gods. We saw this as they were going through the wilderness, how they kept their gods and idols with them. They'd forgotten the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. But all firstborn are to die. And as the book of Hebrews explains, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood. And without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. That's a strong thought. All firstborn in the land are to die. But God, in dealing with his chosen people, shows them grace. He doesn't erase their sin. What he does instead is he accepts the blood of a lamb without blemish as a substitute for the blood of the firstborn. That's what he did. So that the firstborn of Israel would not die as the angel of death passed over. The sacrifice of the Paschal lamb was not just part of a ceremony or a rite to be mimicked later on. It was in fact to pay for the price of the sins of the firstborn in order to redeem or buy them back from the judgment of the angel of death. It's amazing to me that God's justice allows for the substitution of one life for the redemption of another. This is God's justice, but also his grace. After Moses leads them through the Red Sea, God reminds them that he still holds claim to the firstborn, even though their lives have been redeemed by the blood of the Paschal lamb. He now makes a really surprising offer. Scholars don't conjecture why God did this, but he offered to exchange the firstborn of all of Israel for the tribe of Levi. Why did he do that? I don't know. But he chose to do that. And he said, I will take the tribe of Levi to serve me specifically. So, to make sure that this was, for some reason, a fair trade, he took a census of all the firstborn. And he took a census of the same age males in the tribe of Levi. And you know what? They didn't quite match. There were 273 more firstborns than there were in the tribe of Levi. They don't fit. There's going to be 273 people out there that aren't swapped, as it were. So God says, I will introduce another way of dealing with this for you. If you sacrifice 5 shekels, you can all reach in your pocket and see if you have your 5 shekel piece with you. If you give 5 shekels offering to Aaron, I will accept the deal as done. And so he did. The Israelites gave the 5 shekels for each of the 273 firstborn, and God accepted the tribe of Levi to serve them. Again, an execution of his justice, but involving a redemption of someone else. So now they're across the river, across the sea. God reveals a plan, his plan, to dwell with his chosen people. Not just appear in the cloud or in the pillar of fire or anything, but to actually dwell with them in the tabernacle. Now here we have a screenshot of what that tabernacle kind of looks like. It shows the different areas of the inner court, the tent of the meeting, and the holiest of holies. God would dwell in the holiest of holies, above the Ark of the Covenant, on the mercy seat between the cherubim. Here we have a reasonable facsimile of the Ark of the Covenant. This is what we think the Ark basically looked like. Now you notice in the background you see the Ark, that's about the right size. And behind that man standing in front, who we all know is Indiana Jones, you see the cherubim with the wings stretched out. And God would dwell on that mercy seat or propitiatory. That's where he would come to dwell. God chooses Aaron and his sons to be his priest, to serve in this holy place where his presence dwells. But how can they serve him? They are unclean, and they can't even look at God without death. Remember? They wanted to go up with Moses and see God. In fact, Moses wanted to look at God, and God said, no, you can't see me, or you will die. So how are we going to do this? Again, God's perfect law made way for his love to be shown. Aaron and his sons would be sanctified or set apart from the rest of the Levites. A special sacrifice had been given. Again, the shedding of more blood to pay for their sins on a very regular basis. They were given in specific, explicit instructions on how the priests were to operate and perform their functions when in the temple, when in the Holy of Holies, when in the inner court of the tent of meeting. They were still prohibited from being in the Holy of Holies and that close to God, except for the high priest, 1 day a year, on the Day of Atonement, in which the priest would offer additional sacrifices for his own sins and the sins of the people. And then the high priest would be allowed to go into the Holy of Holies, stand before the Ark of the Covenant, and be in the presence of God himself. Well, how well did this work? Well, let's take a look at 2 of Abraham's sons, Nadab and Ammon. For them, it didn't work so well. They were offering incense, but apparently changed the process. It says they offered unauthorized fire. I don't know what unauthorized fire is. Nobody else seems to be willing to conjecture. Maybe it was in their incense container they had lit applewood so it would smell nicer, or instead of sassafras root or something. I don't know. But whatever they did, it wasn't authorized by God. It was not in accordance with His law. The result was they were immediately struck down. Does this sound like a gracious, loving God who extends loving kindness and fairness to someone? No, this was a God that gave very explicit instructions to someone who was going to be in His very presence. Nadab and Abihu were trained. They knew God's specific directives, but decided that their way was better. You don't know the Frank Sinatra song, "I'll do it my way." And that's what they did. Would you not expect Him to respond with perfect righteousness to this violation of His most sacred presence and precept? A presence so sacred that the Levites had to station guards all around the tabernacle with instruction to kill anyone that tried to enter. God's presence was sacred. God will not have anything unclean in His presence. He will defend His perfect will and holiness. Soon it's time for the Israelites to move on. Now, since the priests were the only ones authorized to actually be in the presence of the tabernacle, of the Ark of the Covenant, or the table of the shewbread, or the lampstands, or anything else, the priests were given the responsibility to wrap them up. So they took this purple cloth, and they wrapped them up, and then they took porpoise skin and wrapped them up in porpoise skin. I don't know why, but that's what God told them to do. So that nobody could see the holy articles. Then once they had them all wrapped up, then they would put long poles through hooks or circles that had been made into the items so that they could be carried without touching them or seeing them. And then there was a group assigned out of the sons of Levi called the Kohathites. They were another group of Levi's sons, and they were charged with carrying the items on these long poles so that nobody would see them or touch them, under penalty of death. Here we have an example of them carrying the Ark of the Covenant. Now, this is not a recent picture, but this is what we kind of think it looked like. This is how the tabernacle elements were carried through the wilderness, across the Jordan, around the Promised Land, where they eventually rested in a town called Shiloh. Now, many years passed, and as you remember, the Israelites were constantly fighting the Philistines. And on this particular occasion, the Israelites were losing pretty badly. Someone, however, had the great idea, hey, when we came into the land a couple hundred years ago, everybody fled from the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. Let's go get the Ark of the Covenant and bring it back down here to our battleground. So they did. The Ark arrived, but made no changes in the battle. In fact, Israel lost even more men, 21,000 men that day, and they lost the Ark of the Covenant. The Philistines had captured their most sacred possession. Years later, David comes to the throne. And David does battle with the Philistines. And he has a major army around him. He goes in and he captures back the Ark of the Covenant. And David says, well, I want to make a proper place for the Ark of the Covenant and the elements in the tabernacle so that they can be worshipped properly in the city of Jerusalem. And so he directed that the Ark of the Covenant be recovered and that the poles be put in there. And then he told the Kohathites, who were responsible for the transport, and I think they were part of the Kohathite Moving and Storage Company, they had had this task for a long time. And so they came up with a way of going back. That was a long way back to Jerusalem. It's not just right over the hill. So instead of carrying it the whole way, they put it on a cart. Mistake one. And as they were carrying the cart back, one of the oxen stumbled. And of course, you're going on stumbling, boom. I've stumbled a few times myself, and I actually fell a lot further than that. But as the ox stumbled, the cart started to shift, ready to hit the ground. And Uzzah says, oh, wait. I don't want to have that ark hit the ground. That would make me look bad for not properly carrying it. So he reaches up to stop the ark from falling, kind of as you see the picture there. And of course God says, oh, thank you, Uzzah. Just what we needed. No, God didn't quite say that. God said, Zach, you violated a very specific law. You were trained in how to transport the articles of the Israelite worship. You know you cannot touch it. But he did. Uzzah said, I have a better idea. I will exercise my judgment. I will attack the holiness of God. So though well-intentioned, he had attacked the holiness of God, and God executed his just, righteous response. Now, what do these stories tell us about God and his justice? Well, they tell us that God's will is perfect. That he always acts in accordance with his perfect will. They tell us that he will act to preserve and maintain his holiness against all comers. They tell us even that God's execution of his judgment, he has made grace part of it. Now, his grace allows for the substitutionary shedding of blood of someone for another. We understand that while the sacrifices were only able to protect the Israelites from God's wrath for a time, a true sacrifice would come. And it would pay the full price of the sin, cleansing us, enabling us to stand before the Father. Not with spaghetti sauce all over our shirts, but in a robe of righteousness provided by the perfect Lamb himself. 2 weeks ago, Pastor Rick spoke about the book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Now, at the risk of being a spoiler to this book, and if you haven't read that book, or read it to your children, or read it to your grandchildren, I strongly encourage you, do it. But, spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you how it ends anyway. The witch, who was a major character in the book, reminds Aslan, who was the lion that was spoken of 2 weeks ago, of the deep magic of the Emperor Beyond the Sea, which says that any treachery committed in Narnia, where this story takes place, is punishable by death at the witch's hand. Edmund, the younger brother, did just that, and he was taken by the White Witch. Naturally, his brothers and sisters were distraught. But Aslan, the great lion, who was more than just good, who was mentioned a few weeks ago, struck a deal, struck a bargain with the witch to exchange his life for Edmund's. The White Witch was just overjoyed at this, since she would now be in total control of the land of Narnia. When the appointed time came, Aslan walked into the witch's camp. He laid down on a large stone table. Edmund was set free. But then they came with razors and shavers, and they shaved Aslan's mane. They shaved his whole body. And then they tied it with ropes. And then, with all of her minions standing around and cheering, the witch took the large knife and undoubtedly put it in Aslan's heart to kill him. The story doesn't use those words, but that's what happened. The witch and the followers left this event to rejoice, and now lay the plans to take over all of Narnia. Now, during the night, there was a huge cracking sound heard, and the stone table split in two, and Aslan was gone. The next day, the children, who were very, very upset over this whole thing, saw a lion off in the distance, but they didn't really believe it could be Aslan. But as he approached them, they ran to him, jumped on him, hugged him. Finally, they asked what happened that he was alive. Aslan responded, "It means," says Aslan, "that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a deeper magic still which she does not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time. But if she could have looked a little further back into the stillness and the darkness before time dawned, she would have read there a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in the traitor's stead, the table would crack, and death itself would start working backwards." We recognize the symbolism in this story. It reminds us of the justice of God. That God is the source and author of righteousness, that he will defend his holiness against assault. The death is the price to be paid for violating his laws. But it also reminds us of an even deeper truth, that he loves his own. And from before time, he had a plan to redeem them, while still being true to his laws and holiness. We are also reminded that while the blood of lambs and goats may serve to cover sin for a time, it is only the perfect sacrifice of the perfect Lamb that erases our debt forever. We remember these truths today as we come to the communion table, partake of the elements. The body broken for us, the blood spilled for us, that we may in one day come to partake of the feast at the great table. Not wearing our shirts with spaghetti sauce on them, but clothed in brilliant white robes of righteousness given to us by Jesus Christ, the righteous one, the just. This is God's justice. This is his righteousness maintained. This is his grace and love demonstrated toward us.